The first time my pension didn't show up. I told myself not to make a fuss over it. Banks have delays, computers mess up. Lord knows I've hit the wrong button on my phone more times than I care to admit. So I poured another cup of coffee, carried it out onto my little balcony, and figured it'd sort itself out before lunch. Funny how your whole world can change before a cup of coffee gets cold. I checked my account again. Still, nothing. Now, I'd only been living in the Philippines about 3 months, long enough to know which lady at the market always slipped an extra tomato into my bag, long enough for the neighborhood dogs to quit barking every time I walked past, long enough that the little apartment I'd rented didn't feel temporary anymore. It felt like home. That check wasn't just money. It paid my rent, bought my groceries, covered my medicine, kept the lights on. It was the reason I could live the life my husband and I had spent years dreaming about. Without it, well, I didn't know how many mornings I had left before I'd have to start making decisions I wasn't ready to make. I refreshed the screen again. Nothing. The only thing I could say was, "Well, Lord, that's not good." I didn't panic, not yet. Truth be told, I figured it'd probably show up tomorrow. But before tomorrow ever came, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I started counting every dollar I had left. And that's when I realized, if this wasn't just a delay, I was in a whole lot more trouble than I'd first thought. If you'd asked me 10 years earlier if I'd ever move halfway around the world, I'd have laughed. Probably would have asked what on earth I'd do over here. I spent just about my whole life in the same little part of Kentucky. Not right in town, mind you. We lived outside Bowling Green on a couple acres where the grass always seemed to grow faster than Tom could mow it. There wasn't anything fancy about our place. White house, green shutters, big maple tree out front that dropped enough leaves every fall to keep us busy for weeks. Lord, I miss that tree sometimes. Tom used to complain about raking those leaves every year. Then one autumn he looked over at me and said, "You know, one day we're going to miss having leaves to rake." I laughed and told him he'd bumped his head. Funny the things that stick with you. Tom wasn't much for big vacations. We weren't cruise people, didn't own an RV, never cared much about impressing anybody. We just liked simple things: Saturday breakfast, fishing when the weather behaved, watching old westerns after supper. He'd usually be asleep before the second commercial break. I'd nudge him awake, and he'd swear he wasn't sleeping. 44 years of marriage. Some things never change. Then one evening, maybe 6 years before he passed, he started watching videos on YouTube. People retiring overseas. Places we'd never heard much about. Costa Rica, Mexico, Vietnam. Then one night, he found the Philippines. At first, I thought it'd be one of those ideas that lasts about a week. Tom had plenty of those. 1 month, he was convinced we needed chickens. Another month, he wanted bees. Thank goodness neither one happened. But this one stayed. Every evening after supper, he'd say, "Come here, Linda, you've got to see this." And there we'd sit, 2 old folks on a worn-out couch, watching strangers walk through markets we'd never visited, eating food we'd never tasted, talking about stretching a retirement check farther than we ever thought possible. It wasn't really about saving money. Well, not only about saving money. It was about slowing down, about waking up somewhere warm, about hearing birds instead of traffic, about finally having time. We used to tell each other, when we're retired, we'll go for a year. Just 1 year. If we hated it, we'd come home. Simple as that. But life has a way of changing plans without asking first. Tom got sick. At first we thought it was just getting older. Then came doctor's appointments, more tests, more waiting rooms. You know how that goes. The day they finally told us it was cancer, I remember staring at the doctor's lips moving. I could see him talking. I just couldn't hear a word he said. Everything after that felt like somebody had hit the fast forward button. Treatments, hospital visits, good days, bad days. Then, no more good days. The night before Tom passed, he reached over and squeezed my hand. Didn't have much strength left, barely enough to talk. He smiled anyway, and he whispered, "Promise me something." I leaned in close. He said, "If I don't make it, you still go." I started crying before he even finished. I told him we weren't having that conversation. He just smiled, that little crooked smile I'd been looking at for over 40 years. "You still go, Linda. One of us ought to see it." For the longest time after he was gone, I couldn't even bring myself to watch those old Philippines videos. Every thumbnail reminded me of him. Every beach, every market, every smiling face. It all hurt too much. Until one rainy afternoon, I clicked on one by accident. Or maybe it wasn't an accident after all. By the time that video ended, I already knew. If I didn't go, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what would have happened if I'd kept that promise. So at 68 years old, I sold most of what I owned, packed 2 suitcases, hugged my daughter and those sweet grandboys goodbye, and climbed onto the longest flight I'd ever taken. I kept thinking about something Tom used to say. Life's shorter than we think. Turns out, he was right. I won't sit here and tell you everything was perfect, because it wasn't. That first week, Lord, I don't think I slept more than 4 hours a night. My body had no earthly idea what time it was. I'd wake up at 2 a.m, wide awake, then feel sleepy right about lunchtime. The roosters certainly didn't help. I swear one of them lived right outside my bedroom window. Never did see him, but every morning around 4:30, there he'd be, cock-a-doodle-doo, like he was getting paid for it. Back home, I'd have been fussin' about it. Over here, honestly, after a while I kind of grinned when I heard him. Guess that meant another day had started. There were little things to learn. How much cash to carry. Which tricycle drivers charged fair prices. How to cross the road without looking terrified. That one took me a little while. Cars, motorcycles, scooters, it all seemed to flow together like somebody had made up their own traffic rules. The funny part? Nobody seemed angry. Back home, folks would have been honking every 5 seconds. Here, everybody just figured it out. The market became my favorite place. I'd walk there 2 or 3 mornings a week, mostly because it gave me something to do, but also because fresh vegetables actually tasted like vegetables. Tom would have loved that place. He always said tomatoes ought to smell like tomatoes. These did. The lady who sold bananas learned my name after maybe the 3rd visit, or maybe the 4th. I can't rightly remember. One morning, I reached into my bag after I'd already paid, and there were 2 extra bananas. I looked up and she just nodded. No charge. I tried handing them back. She waved me away. That sort of thing happened more than once. Not because I needed charity. People were just kind. My apartment wasn't fancy. Small living room, tiny kitchen, bedroom just big enough for the bed and a little dresser. But every evening I'd open the windows and let the breeze come through. Sometimes I'd sit on that balcony until after dark, listening to people talk. Kids laughing somewhere down the street. Somebody singing karaoke entirely too loud. It wasn't always good singing either. Matter of fact, most nights it wasn't. I'd just laugh. Tom would have laughed too. I started thinking less about what I'd left behind, and more about what tomorrow might bring. For the first time since losing him, The future didn't scare me quite so much. After about 3 months, I'd gotten into a rhythm. Somewhere near the first of the month, I'd see the deposit come in. I'd pay the rent first, then the electric bill, put a little aside into savings. Whatever was left, that was mine to enjoy. Nothing extravagant. Maybe supper out once in a while. Fresh fruit. A sweet roll from the bakery if I happened to walk past. I wasn't rich. Never had been. But for the first time in a long while, I wasn't worrying every time I spent a few pesos. Looking back now, maybe that's why what happened next caught me so off guard. I'd gotten comfortable. Comfortable has a funny way of making you think tomorrow's gonna look just like today. Sometimes it doesn't. The first day of the month rolled around. Same as always. I made my coffee, opened my banking app, and waited for the little number I'd seen every month for years to appear. Only, this time, it didn't. I stared at my phone for another minute or two. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny, just because I felt a little silly. Linda, I told myself, you've survived raising a teenager, burying a husband, and 31 years working at an elementary school. You can survive a late deposit. So I set my phone down, finished my coffee, even watered the little potted plant sitting out on the balcony. I can't tell you what kind of plant it was. Bought it from a woman on the side of the road because she grinned at me. Seemed like reason enough. By lunchtime, I'd almost forgotten about the money. I walked down to the market, picked up tomatoes, rice, a little chicken. The fish vendor tried talking me into buying milkfish again. I let out a breath and told him, maybe next time. Truth is, I still hadn't figured out how to cook it without making a mess. He laughed. I laughed. Life kept moving. That evening, I checked my account again. Still nothing. Now, that caught my attention. I opened the banking app 3 different times, logged out, logged back in, even turned my phone completely off and back on. You know, like somehow that fixes everything. It didn't. I just sat there on the edge of my bed saying, this is getting a little strange. I still wasn't scared. Concerned? Sure. But scared? No. I figured maybe the bank was having some sort of issue. Maybe it was because I was overseas. Maybe the payment had landed in the wrong account for all I knew. There always seems to be somebody pushing the wrong button somewhere. I decided I'd wait one more day. No sense spending hours worrying over something that might solve itself overnight. That was always Tom's way of looking at things. If it's still broken tomorrow, then we'll fix it tomorrow. So I tried doing that. The next morning, the rooster did his usual announcing. The neighbors were already sweeping their yards before sunrise. Somebody down the street was cooking garlic. You could smell it drifting through the windows. I made coffee, opened the app, held my breath. Nothing. Not 1 penny. Now my stomach tightened. I don't mean butterflies. I mean that heavy feeling, like somebody had quietly set a cinder block right in the middle of your chest. I grabbed my little notebook from the kitchen drawer. Every month I'd write down my expenses. Nothing fancy, just an old spiral notebook. Rent, electric, water, internet, medicine, groceries. I'd been doing it for years. Old habits stick around. I started adding everything up. Then I looked at my savings. Then I did the math again, because I didn't like the first answer. If nothing changed, I could cover my bills for a while. Not forever, not even close. Long enough to stay calm, but not long enough to ignore it. That's when something crossed my mind that I hadn't wanted to think about. What if this wasn't a delay? What if something had actually happened to my pension? I pushed that thought away almost as soon as it showed up. No sense borrowing trouble. That's what my mama used to say. Trouble has a funny way of finding you without an invitation. It doesn't need you going out looking for it. Still, that afternoon I found myself doing something I hadn't done since arriving in the Philippines. I stopped looking at things I wanted and started looking only at things I needed. I stood in front of a little bakery I'd walked past dozens of times. Fresh bread had just come out of the oven. It smelled wonderful. Normally I'd buy a loaf, maybe a little sweet roll if they had one. Instead, I smiled at the lady behind the counter, waved, and kept walking. It wasn't because I couldn't afford the bread. Not yet. It was because I didn't know what tomorrow was going to look like anymore. And when you don't know what's coming, you start hanging on to every peso you've got. I wish I could tell you that was the hardest part. It wasn't, not even close. Because later that afternoon, I finally decided it was time to start making phone calls. And that turned out to be a whole different kind of problem. I've never liked talking on the phone much, worked in a school office long enough to spend half my life answering one. By the time I retired, I'd had enough ringing phones to last me forever. Still, there wasn't much choice now. I started with my bank back home. First came the automated menu, then the hold music. 43 minutes of it. By the time someone finally answered, I probably knew every note by heart. I explained everything. He checked my account, asked a few security questions, then got quiet. You ever notice how silence on the other end of the phone is almost worse than bad news? Finally, he said, "Mrs. Harper, I don't actually see a deposit pending." The bank had never received it. He suggested I call the office that sent the payment instead. After I hung up, I just sat there for a minute. The ceiling fan kept spinning overhead. Somebody outside was laughing about something. Life all around me kept moving like nothing had changed. The strange thing was, the whole world looked exactly the same. It was mine that suddenly felt like it was coming apart. Different office, different menu, different hold music. This time I had to think about the time difference back home. I'd forgotten it was still the middle of the night in Kentucky. Guess that's one thing about living halfway around the world. Somebody's always asleep when you're trying to fix a problem. The following evening, I finally reached someone. She was kind, really kind. Asked all the right questions, verified my information, put me on hold twice, then came back and said something that made my heart sink. "Mrs. Harper, it looks like your payments have been suspended." Suspended. Now there's a word that'll stop you cold. I asked why. She said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. I can't see the reason from my end." That's all she knew. She gave me another number to call, another department, another office, another wait. I thanked her anyway. Wasn't her fault. People can only tell you what the computer lets them see. I remember setting my phone on the kitchen table, walking out onto the balcony. The sun was just starting to go down. The sky had that soft orange color it gets here right before evening. It was beautiful. I could hear kids playing somewhere nearby. A motorcycle buzzed past. Somebody had started another karaoke song. Same fellow as always, still couldn't carry a tune. Normally I'd smile. That evening, I barely noticed, because one word just kept bouncing around inside my head. Suspended. Not delayed, not late, suspended. I didn't know what I'd done, didn't know if I'd forgotten to sign something, didn't know if somebody had stolen my identity, didn't know if there'd been some mistake. I didn't even know where to begin fixing it. For the first time since moving to the Philippines, the thought crossed my mind. Maybe everybody back home had been right. Maybe I had been foolish to move so far away. Maybe I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I stood there watching the last bit of sunlight disappear. Then I caught myself. Tom would have hated hearing me talk like that. He had a way of cutting through my worrying. He used to say, "Don't write the ending before you've read the middle." I just stood there. "All right, Tom," I whispered. "I'm trying." By sunrise, I decided I wasn't going to sit in that apartment feeling sorry for myself. If I couldn't get an answer that day, at least I could do something useful. What I didn't know was that a short walk to the neighborhood market was about to change this whole story. Early the next morning, I woke up before the rooster for a change. Don't ask me how. Maybe my mind had been working all night while the rest of me pretended to sleep. I made coffee. Didn't even bother checking my bank account. There wasn't much point. If somebody was going to fix it, it wasn't likely to happen between 6 o'clock and breakfast. So I grabbed my little shopping bag and headed toward the market. I'd made up my mind before I left the apartment. I wasn't buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. No bakery, no little treats, no fresh mangoes, even though they'd been in season and looked mighty tempting. Just the basics: rice, tomatoes, maybe a little pechay. The market was already busy. Same folks setting up their tables, same tricycles buzzing past, same little girl chasing a puppy that never seemed interested in being caught. It felt normal, almost too normal, like the whole world had agreed to carry on while I was busy worrying. I stopped at the vegetable stand first. The woman smiled when she saw me. "Good morning, Miss Linda." I smiled back. "Morning." She started putting tomatoes into a bag, then some onions, a few green beans. When she told me the total, I caught myself hesitating. Not because I couldn't pay, because for the first time, I was wondering if I should. She must have noticed. People notice more than we think they do. "You okay?" Such a simple question. 3 little words. I almost answered the way we all do. "Oh, I'm fine." But for some reason, I didn't. I shrugged. "Shoot, just got a little problem back home." She tilted her head. "What kind of problem?" "My pension didn't come this month." I laughed a little after I said it. Guess I was trying to make it sound smaller than it felt. She didn't ask 100 questions, didn't offer advice. She just nodded. Then she reached over, dropped another tomato into the bag, and said, "You'll figure it out." That was it. No big speech, no dramatic moment, just confidence, like she believed it. Somehow, that helped. I thanked her, started digging for my wallet. She stopped me, pointed at the tomatoes. "No charge." "Oh, no," I said. "I can pay." She shook her head. "Next time." I stood there for a second, not quite knowing what to do. Where I come from, people don't usually accept things like that from strangers, at least not without arguing about it for 5 minutes. Finally, I laughed. "Well, I reckon next time it is." As I walked away, I realized something. She wasn't giving me tomatoes because she thought I was poor. She was giving them to me because somebody she saw every week was having a hard day. There's a difference. One feels like charity. The other feels like kindness. I tucked that little bag under my arm and kept walking. A few minutes later, I stopped at the rice shop. The owner waved me over before I even reached the counter. "Miss Linda, you disappeared yesterday. I was beginning to think you'd found a better rice seller." I laughed. "Not a chance." He grinned. "I'd have to lower my prices." We both knew he wasn't going to. As he filled the sack, he asked if everything was all right. Word travels fast in neighborhoods like this. Maybe the lady at the vegetable stand had mentioned something. Maybe I just looked tired. Either way, I told him I was waiting on some money from America. He nodded like he'd heard that story before. Then he said something I'll never forget. "Money comes, money goes, people stay." I carried those words home with me. At the time, I wasn't sure I believed them, but I remembered them anyway. That afternoon, I spread everything out on my little kitchen counter. Not much. Enough food for several days if I was careful. As I looked at those extra tomatoes, I couldn't help smiling. It wasn't because of what they were worth. Lord, it couldn't have been more than $1 or $2. It was because somebody had reminded me, without even trying, that I wasn't facing this alone. I still didn't know why my pension had stopped. I still had no idea how long it would take to fix, but something inside me had shifted. Instead of thinking, "What if I lose everything?" I found myself thinking, "All right, what's the next step?" And that simple change in the way I looked at things ended up making all the difference. The following morning, I decided I'd had enough of wondering. Wondering wears a person out. You keep asking yourself the same questions, and somehow every answer gets worse than the one before it. So I made another cup of coffee, opened my notebook, and started making a list. Every phone number I'd called, who I'd talked to, what they'd told me. By then the pages were beginning to look like a detective's notebook. Arrows, notes in the margins, little circles around things I didn't understand. I laughed to myself. If my old principal could have seen that notebook, he'd have told me to start over and write a cleaner copy. That man liked everything neat. Life, not so much. I made one more phone call that afternoon. Another department, another hold. This time I didn't mind the waiting quite as much. Maybe I'd finally accepted that getting answers takes time. When the gentleman finally came on the line, his voice sounded older, calm, the kind of voice that doesn't seem to get rattled. He asked a few questions, verified my information, tapped away on his keyboard for what felt like forever. Then he said, "Mrs. Harper? I believe I know what's happened." I leaned forward so quickly I nearly knocked my coffee onto the floor. He explained there was a verification issue connected to my retirement payments now that I was living overseas. They needed updated paperwork before they could release the next deposit. I asked him what I'd done wrong. He said it wasn't always about doing something wrong. Sometimes a form gets missed. Sometimes a notice never reaches you. Sometimes they simply need updated information before payments continue. I sat there trying to think back. I'd been packing my whole life into 2 suitcases before leaving Kentucky, selling furniture, changing my address, forwarding mail. Somewhere in all that, something had slipped through the cracks. Whether I'd overlooked a letter, misunderstood what they needed, or simply missed a deadline, I honestly couldn't tell you. But finally, I knew why the payment had stopped. I can't tell you how relieved I felt, and how embarrassed I felt, both at exactly the same time. I let out the biggest sigh. The poor fellow on the other end of the phone chuckled. He said, "Mrs. Harper, you'd be surprised how often this happens." That made me feel a little better. He explained exactly what I needed to do. Most of it wasn't difficult, just time-consuming. A couple forms, proof of identity, verification. Then, more waiting. Always more waiting. Before we hung up, I thanked him, probably 2 or 3 times. He finally laughed and said, "I think we've got you headed in the right direction." When the call ended, I didn't celebrate. Not yet. Because the deposit still wasn't in my account. The problem wasn't solved. Now I simply knew what the problem was. And somehow that changed everything. There's something comforting about knowing what mountain you're climbing, even if it's still a steep one. That evening I fixed myself a simple supper. Rice, a little grilled chicken, those tomatoes I'd brought home from the market. As I sliced one of them, I caught myself smiling. Just a few days earlier, I'd been imagining every worst-case scenario I could think of. Now I finally had something better than fear. I had a plan. And for the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I slept through the night. Or at least, until that rooster decided I'd had enough sleep. Some things never change. The paperwork took another week, maybe a little longer. Time has a funny way of blurring together when you're waiting. Every morning I'd make coffee, feed that little balcony plant I'd somehow managed not to kill, open my banking app, then go on with my day. I stopped staring at the screen every hour. There wasn't much point. The forms were submitted, the calls had been made. Now, it was out of my hands. Funny enough, life started feeling normal again. I'd walk to the market, wave at the same vendors, listen to the neighborhood waking up. Some mornings I'd catch myself smiling for no particular reason. One afternoon I was sitting on the balcony, watching a summer rain roll through. It came down hard for maybe 15 minutes. Then, just as quick, the sun came back out like nothing had happened. The little kids in the neighborhood were laughing, running barefoot through puddles, their mothers yelling at them from the porches. I remember thinking, Tom would have loved this. Not because of the rain, because of the noise. He always said a quiet neighborhood wasn't much of a neighborhood. I laughed out loud, sitting there all by myself. A lady hanging laundry across the way looked over at me. I just waved. She waved right back. Then, one Thursday morning, I wasn't even thinking about my pension. I was actually looking up a recipe somebody had given me for chicken adobo. Mine still didn't taste quite right. Too much vinegar, or maybe not enough. I don't know. I opened my banking app to check another payment, mostly out of habit, and there it was. No fanfare, no flashing notification, no dramatic music, just the deposit. Same amount as always. I looked at it for a second, then I closed the app. Didn't cry, didn't shout, didn't call anybody. I just sat there, coffee in one hand, phone in the other, listening to another rooster announce himself to the whole barangay. After everything I'd imagined, after all those sleepless nights, the moment I'd been waiting for lasted maybe 30 seconds. I smiled, looked up toward the sky, and quietly said, "Well, Tom, I reckon we're going to be all right." That afternoon I walked straight to the bakery, bought the sweet roll I'd talked myself out of 2 weeks earlier, sat outside with a cup of coffee, took one bite, and laughed. Funny thing was, it wasn't nearly as good as I'd remembered. Turns out, it was never really about the sweet roll. Then I stopped by the vegetable stand. The same woman smiled when she saw me. "You okay now?" I smiled. "Yep. Everything finally worked itself out." She nodded, like she'd known it would all along. I paid for my vegetables. Then, before I left, I bought a few extra mangoes. Not because I needed them, just because I could. As I walked home, I started thinking about those 2 weeks. Before all this happened, I'd believed my pension was what made me feel secure. Turns out, it wasn't. Security wasn't seeing money show up on the 1st of every month. It was knowing that if life knocked me down, there were people who'd ask if I was all right. People who remembered my name. People who slipped an extra tomato into my bag without making me feel ashamed. People who reminded me that hard times don't last forever. Back in Kentucky, I thought home was a white house with green shutters and a maple tree out front. That's what home meant for most of my life. These days, I think home is something different. Home is where somebody notices when you don't show up. Home is where people remember your name. Home is where someone quietly slips an extra tomato into your shopping bag because they can tell you've had a rough week. Sometimes, home ends up 12 time zones away from where you were born. And somehow, I think Tom knew that long before I did.